when he was in Russia. And he was disagree with everything what happened at the end of 90s and the beginning of 2000. He needs to go out from Russia. He escaped because he wanted to save not only himself, he wanted to save his family, his young son, who was only 6 years old then. But he didn't betray his country. When he was in UK, he tried to help people to understand what might happen to his country. And he tried to present what is the leader of this country might make to you, Russia. And actually what we have now in 2016, we understand what Sasha tried to say. It actually was the truth. But he was killed. He was killed in 2006. He was not only killed, he was tortured. Till last moment, it was not knowledge is radioactive material. Only because Sasha was very strong, he survived for all these 23 days. And just a few hours before he died, polonium was discovered. If it's not, we'll never ever be able to understand why he died. And this all investigation, what was provided British police, and all this public inquiry what we had last year, it's incredible. And I believe it might never happen again, and nobody at the world will be killed by polonium-210. But we still have this question. Who made this possible to bring polonium to London? Who makes this order to kill my husband? And I'm very proud of this public inquiry verdict, but I'm sure it's not of the end of this road. And I'm looking for support, not only in UK, but everywhere in the world, people will understand how it's important to understand and believe nobody ever again will use radioactive material against humans. And this one, I'm very happy to answer for any of your question, and I do understand it's still interest, and I'm very want to say thank you very much if you know the story from very beginning to the end. And any question, I'm open for this. Thank you.
Marina, let me ask you, on his deathbed, your husband indicated that it was Mr. Putin who was responsible for his poisoning and ultimately for his murder. Lord Owen, in his report, as Damon read, it concludes that the FSB operation to kill your husband was probably approved by Mr. Patrushev and also by President Putin. Can you talk a little bit about both his, your husband's feelings that Putin was responsible, your own, and also based on the conclusions in the Owen report?
Of course, it was a little bit pathetic when Sasha said he blamed Putin of his killing, because Sasha didn't know he was poisoned by polonium at all. Mm-hmm. How I said, it was discovered only in the last hours of his life. Sasha died without this knowledge. I knew about polonium only in a few hours after his death, when I was at home. And well known in the world, it became in use only the next day. But how we know, just before Sasha's poisoning, it was Anna Politkovskaya who was killed in Moscow. And Sasha was devastated because Anna Politkovskaya, it's a famous Russian journalist. She was killed in Moscow, and Sasha promised to investigate this case. And when he has his very strong speech in front of people in Frontline Club in London, he said he believed it's a Putin who killed Anna Politkovskaya. Because it was 2006, and we remember it was a policy from Russian parliament of operation allowed to assassinate people not only in Russia, but in abroad, if they decide these people are enemy of Russia state. And when Anna Politkovskaya was killed, Sasha believed it's very serious because it was a list of names of people. And when he was already in the hospital in the very last stage, and it was a decision for him to write down some statement, and he agreed to say what he said, and he blamed Putin, even without knowledge it was polonium, and he going to die. For me, it was very difficult then to understand why he has to do this, because I believed till last moment Sasha will survive. And I believed he will be able to live his life.
How would you describe the reaction of the British government, both before Lord Owen's report came out and then subsequent to it?
I can't say it was easy. Everybody have a question why it takes so long time, almost 10 years since Sasha died. But after 5 years of full police investigation was completed, and when we realized not Lugovoy, not Kovtun would be extradited, because it was extradition case, but Russia refused to extradite these two men. And we decided to do another jurisdiction, it's an inquest, when we tried to open all evidence what were collected during this investigation. Because after 5 years of Sasha's death, it was a lot of question why and why British blame these two men. But when we tried to go to inquest, and when a coroner, Mr. Sir Robert Owen, first time in official way said, I believe is a Russia state behind of this crime. And then we started this our long journey for justice. Because all this material were so sensitive and they could damage national security, and we were not allowed to use this material in our inquest. And only way to use this material was a public inquiry. And again, it takes another 2 years. It was a moment when I couldn't understand why British government tried to hide this, why they tried to prevent this justice. But I was in the other way, I was supported by all this British law. And I just tried to provide to British people, particularly people in Russia, if you have a real justice, you can get truth. But when we received this verdict, and when I have a meeting with Theresa May, who's the head of Home Office in UK, and they say, yes, we are very happy for this verdict, and they actually knew all this evidence, and they knew is the truth. And now what I do ask them, it's for action. We know the truth, but we can't get these two men from Russia. And what you're going to do next?
Alex, let me turn to you, but first let me extend a warm welcome to my good friend Vladimir for making it despite the Washington traffic. If you can survive poisoning, you can survive Washington traffic.
It actually is worse than in Moscow, so
I'm
I'm
sure.
really sorry. I'm really
That's
sorry.
quite all right.
It's good to see you.
Alex, let me ask you, as someone who's been living essentially in exile in London for many years, the murder of Litvinenko is a signal that even outside of Russia's borders, many of you are not safe. There's still a threat that comes from the Kremlin. Give us your perspective on how you see this and how those of you living outside of Russia feel in response to this.
Well, it has dual impact on the whole community. On the one hand, it shows that nobody is safe. Until this happened, the consensus among expats was that London is as safe as anywhere, that they would never dare to do something like this, not only outside Russia, but particularly in a place like UK. So that was, of course, a wake-up call, that there is no safe place. On the other hand,
Is his mic working?
on the other hand, the fact that they were caught and the finding in the inquiry is that the reason why polonium was used was to essentially make sure that they would never be caught and it would never be found, because it was believed to be a perfect poison which the British would, or anybody would ever discover. And the fact that it was discovered was a pure chance. As Marina mentioned, Sasha died without even knowing it was radioactive poison. It's very difficult to find. So the fact that they were caught and discovered and exposed, and even though it took 10 years to name a Russian state as the power behind this attack, everybody understood it from day one. So the fact that they were caught gives a certain protection to people, because it's, for me personally, it's very unlikely that they would repeat it, at least in the major Western capital, because they were caught. So I would say two impacts for the community.
Vladimir, let me turn to you. Marina described the ordeal that Alexander and she had been through a decade ago and since. If you would tell us your story, which frankly is a miracle that you are here today. You still have evidence of the effects of the poisoning with the cane and some other side effects, but frankly it is amazing that you're with us. You were in Moscow when this happened. You go back and forth. Give us your story, if you would.
Thank you, David. So it's great to be here. Thank you all, and I want to take this opportunity to greet Marina and to just express my admiration for her courage and determination in doing this, in fighting for justice for Alexander, whom I knew very well, and I can't believe it's been almost 10 years. But it's only because of her that there was this inquiry and that we do have this verdict, because it was over an unwillingness, frankly, of the British authorities, who seem to have been, involved in this realpolitik consideration, and they tried to put obstacles in every point of the way. But she did it, and she overcame, and my hat goes off to Marina. But in terms of my own case, I don't remember much, to be honest, so I'm not probably the best person to ask about this, but yes, I was in Moscow, just had a routine work day. I was in a work meeting with two colleagues, which was the fact that saved me, because they could call an ambulance. But I went within the space of 15 minutes from being completely normal to being very, very sick, and slipped into a coma. It was a result of severe poisoning of unidentified origins. They are still unidentified. The only thing we know, there were some tests that showed abnormal concentrations of heavy metals in the blood, but that was it. We don't know the actual substance that they used. But it was a multiple organ failure, and doctors told my wife, who is here, that I had a 5% chance of being alive. So I'm very happy and very fortunate to be here. I have, of course, no doubt that this was deliberate poisoning motivated to kill. Intended to kill and motivated by my political activities in Russia. But soon after I was in Moscow in hospital for a month and a half, then I was taken out here to the US actually for medical rehab. And then at the end of last year I made the decision to go back. I'm now back. In fact, I got my plane in a few hours back to Moscow because I think there's nothing better than they would like us to do than to hide, to run away, to stop doing what we're doing, and we're not going to give them that pleasure. And I think everybody's, has their own place where they can be most effective. And again, I think what Marina did over these last almost 10 years is unbelievable, and she's certainly in the right place doing it. But I think as for us, the public faces of the Russian opposition, it would just send a completely wrong message if we started running away and giving up on what we're doing, and we're not going to give them that pleasure.
Absolutely. We are talking here about two of perhaps the best known cases. A little over a year ago, of course, there was another one, the terrible assassination of Boris Nemtsov, a friend to many of us, just yards from the Kremlin. So this does reflect the determination of the Kremlin to silence the voices of the opposition. I have a list of a few other cases I think just worth noting very quickly. Natalia Pilavina, who I believe is being interrogated today after her apartment was raided last week, a second time it had been raided earlier, affiliated with the Parnas Party on some absurd charges, as is the case with all of these individuals. Andrei Pivovarov, head of Parnas in St. Petersburg, an Open Russia coordinator, arrested for 2 months. Ildar Dadin, an activist who was jailed for 3 years for violating Russia's new law on public assemblies and for repeated anti-government street protests. Mark Gelperin, another Russian activist, the investigative committee has launched investigations against him for quote-unquote multiple violation of the law on public gatherings. Georgy Alborov, another Russian opposition activist with Navalny's party. This was in June 2015, charged with stealing a picture that was painted on plywood and affixed to a fence in Vladimir. Leonid Volkov, a founder of the political party People's Alliance, accused of the obstruction of the lawful activities of a journalist of pro-Putin's Life News, and Ivan Nepomniachtchik, another Russian oppositionist, sentenced for 2 years in jail last December for participating in a rally. And just in the past few days, I'd also add to this that the investigative authorities have already determined that the rifle scope image in which Vladimir and Mikhail Kasyanov were featured on Ramzan Kadyrov's website, that there were no violations found according to the FSB. That apparently is okay to do, to paint literally a target on Russian opposition figures, placing them in grave danger. Of course, Boris was a victim of this as well. And not coincidentally, perhaps, Kadyrov's spokesman yesterday criticized Ilya Yashin and said that there should be a criminal investigation opened against him for the report that he issued just a few weeks ago. So justice is perverted in Russia to the extent it exists at all. What can we do from the outside? Here you are in Washington, Marina. What is it you would like to see people in Washington do? Congress, the administration, activists, people in NGOs like we are here today?
I'm absolutely sure to provide all information what really in Russian and how it's situation to people, all these oppositional leaders or even just a member of opposition. It's very important. You have to know what real Russia is now. Because it's very often we can hear, it's fine. Russia under Putin is a country, it's okay. It's a country that deserves this president, but it's not true. Because we can see these people who try to fight for real Russia, not under Putin control. And every time to provide this information about these people and try to make any support what is possible in a legal way, I think it's very, very important. And these people have to understand they are not alone in this fight against this regime and for democracy for Russia. It's very important.
Vladimir, the same question. I'll
Thanks,
go down
David.
the road
If I
here.
could, just a couple of comments. You mentioned we did get a response from the FSB 3 days ago on the crosshairs, saying that there's no grounds, just one paragraph long. But I have to give some credit to the investigative committee because we got a response from them also, because we submitted it to 2 organizations. So the FSB just told us to go away. But the investigative committee sent us a very polite letter. We also got it 3 days ago, and it says that they have forwarded our request for investigation under the territorial subdivisions to the Directorate of the Investigative Committee in the Chechen Republic.
Oh,
So
I'm sure
we're now expecting,
case
an invitation from
Right.
Mr. Kadyrov to
Right.
Grozny for questioning, I suppose.
Right.
And talking about absurd charges that you mentioned a few minutes ago on those, on the few political cases that you mentioned. Talking about absurd charges, just before the New Year in December, we had raids on our offices of Open Russia in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And several of our activists had the houses searched, 1930s style, at 6 o'clock in the morning, bangs on the door, there are teams of people. Anyway, so the case they used for the searches, to authorize the search, is the original Yukos case, which was opened in 2003, but which relates to an episode in 1994, the alleged theft of their shares of Apatit. So the case dates from 1994, and one of our activists who had her house searched, she was born in 1989, another one who was born in 1991. So he was 3 at the time that case was, that case was initiated. So this is just I don't think you could really get any more absurd than this. But on a serious note, according to Memorial Human Rights Center, which is probably the most respected human rights group in our country, we now have, according to, as of today, 53 political prisoners in the Russian Federation. And this is using the high standard set by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe Resolution 1900 on what constitutes a political prisoner. 53 people. And they include some of the cases you mentioned, Ildar Dadin, who received 3 years for nothing for staging one-man street demonstrations. The brother of Alexei Navalny, who's held as a hostage. Right. They include Alexei Pichugin, the remaining hostage of the Yukos case. They, of course, include the Bolotnaya prisoners, people who have no other guilt, quote unquote, than to have demonstrated against Putin's inauguration on the streets of Moscow in May 2012. So 53 people. But to your question about what can the West do, and we often get asked this at international meetings and conferences, and I always say the same thing. The job of bringing democratic changes to Russia, of changing the situation in Russia, it's our job. Mm-hmm. It's nobody else's. Mm-hmm. It's for the Russian opposition, for Russian civil society, for Russian democratic forces to do. It's for no outside actors. What we do ask of our friends and partners in the West, however, is to stay true to your own principles and your own values. And I mean this in one particular sense also. We can talk a lot about the different similarities that exist between the Soviet regime and what we have in Russia today. As we mentioned, political prisoners, the lack of free and fair elections, media censorship, and so forth. But there's also one very important difference. And that difference is that while members of the Soviet Politburo were persecuting their opponents and harassing and muzzling dissent, they didn't store their money in the West. They didn't educate their kids in the West. Mm-hmm. They didn't buy real estate in yachts in the West. The current guys do, both the officials and the Kremlin-connected oligarchs. And frankly, I think that double standard has to end. And it's a very simple principle that those people who trample on the most basic norms of the civilized world should not enjoy the privileges that the civilized world has to offer. And there is now, of course, a tool for this, particularly in this country. Just over 3 years ago, there was a law passed in the United States, signed by President Obama. It's called the Magnitsky Act, which Boris Nemtsov referred to as the most pro-Russian law ever passed in any foreign parliament. And I think there's no better description, because that's the law that targets those who abuse the rights of Russian citizens and those who plunder the resources of Russian taxpayers through official corruption, in the form of visa bans and asset freezes on those people involved in the Magnitsky case itself, but also in other gross human rights abuses. And I think it is a pro-Russian law. It's also a very honorable law, and it's a very effective law for the reasons that I just mentioned. But I think, frankly, that the implementation of this law has been a little timid over those 3 and a bit years that it's been in existence. And 2 years ago, you remember this very well, Boris came to here. Boris Nemtsov came here. This was his last visit to Washington. Yep. And you remember it well because we presented that report on exactly. Olympic corruption in Sochi, yep. together with you and
National
with him
Press Club.
At the National Press Club.
Yep.
That was the last time he came here. And he brought with him a list which included 13 individuals. Mm-hmm. 13 people, high-profile senior people involved in human rights abuse in the Russian Federation. That list, for instance, included Mr. Bastrykin, the head of the investigative committee, who was in charge of several politically motivated investigations and prosecutions, who personally threatened an independent journalist, Sergei Sokolov, deputy editor-in-chief of Novaya Gazeta, with murder, public, and he actually admitted it, so that's not allegedly, that's a fact. Mm. The list included Vladimir Churov, who's become a symbol of massive election fraud in our country over the last few years. It included prosecutors and judges from other politically motivated cases like the Yukos case, like the Bolotnaya case, like the prosecution and subsequent death of Vasily Alexanyan, the former vice president of Yukos. And during that trip, when he came here, we met with senior members of Congress from both parties, with senior administration officials. And this was discussed, but unfortunately 2 years on, not a single person has yet been added to the list, at least to the open section, so what we can tell, what we can know. And then, of course, last year, which you remember well too, it was here that we discussed it at the Atlantic Council, there was another list that former Prime Minister Kasyanov and I brought here. Yep. And it was a list that included 8 employees of the Kremlin state propaganda machine, the Streichers and Nahimanas of Vladimir Putin's Russia. The people who used government-controlled airwaves to incite against Boris Nemtsov in the months leading up to his assassination, to denounce him as a traitor, as an enemy of Russia, as an American agent, as part of the Fifth Column, to compare him with pro-Nazi collaborators in the Second World War. This is all government employees using government-controlled airwaves, day after day after day, and thus creating an environment of hatred, intimidation, and violence, which made it possible to assassinate the leader of the Russian opposition 200 yards away from the Kremlin Wall. That environment didn't just happen. It was created by specific people with specific names. Unfortunately, once again, a year on, none of those people has also been added to the list, at least to the open section. So I think this is a very effective tool that particularly this country has, and I think it should be used to its full extent without any glass ceilings in terms of power and influence, and certainly without being intimidated by the Kremlin. I think it should be used to its full extent because, again, it's an honorable law, it's an effective law, it is a pro-Russian law.
Alex, before I turn to you, let me just add, Vladimir, to the people you cited in addition to the ones I cited. Some people may fluff off the cake that was thrown at Kasyanov, or even more recently at Navalny, and think that's just a little prank. Unfortunately, in Russia, where opposition figures, activists, are demonized by the Kremlin and their hate-mongering propagandists, these things can turn very bloody and very deadly. So one shouldn't just ignore these things.
No,
Alex,
it was funny about Boris as well. When he had ammonia thrown in his eyes, when they threw a toilet over his car, everybody laughed.
And Kasyanov has had more difficulty since then, including rallies and gatherings broken up, physical intimidation, gangs and goons going after him. So it's not a pretty environment there. Alex, from the perspective of London, I want to ask you about the Europeans. There has not been a single European member state that has passed anything even approaching Magnitsky kind of legislation.
No.
Are there any prospects for that to happen, and what's being done to try to make it happen?
Here, obviously, the United States took the lead, and there is a kind of concerted lobbying and information campaign to make it happen, but it's still far from being enacted by any of European parliaments. In many ways, because of the different political system, their parliaments are much less independent from the government than here. But let me come back to your question: what can be done here? I would say that specific actions are important, but more important is the basic policy algorithm with which the Western leaders and policymakers view Putin. What is important to understand, and I think that over the past 2-3 years they began understanding that, is that Mr. Putin and this kind of regime cannot be appeased or tamed or coyed with goodwill gestures or concessions. Because they are basically hostile to the West, and they say that themselves that this is a value clash, and they perceive the very existence of free societies as a threat to their own power, and thereby they present a threat to the Western world because they feel insecure and they feel that their way of ruling the country is inferior in a way to the Western. So they perceive notions of human rights and justice as an existential threat to their very existence. And this is, of course, an old story coming back to the Cold War and so on. So, in this sense, any expectations that you can have a deal or an agreement on some sort of give and take and realpolitik would not work. They will always be hostile. And even if they have an appearance of being friendly, it's not the case. Because, as I said, the Western values and the way of life is as much a threat for Mr. Putin's regime as to any, let's say, theocratic Islamic regime. It's the same kind of challenges. Now, and having said that, I would probably it would be appropriate to say, I've been in this business for decades, starting from, I first testified in Congress in '75, I think, after getting out of the Soviet Union. And it's been going on and on and on, this debate about the appeasement versus containment. I remember Sergei Kovalyov speaking to the senior officials in the administration in the early 2000s, telling them something about Putin, and the response was, don't tell us, we have no illusions, but we have a different policy. This is the policy of constructive engagement. So this was a mistake, and people like Kovalev, for example, and later Sasha Litvinenko or Boris Nemtsov, who come here and try to persuade the policymakers that it's in their own interests of security, first and foremost, to treat this regime as a hostile, basically hostile regime, their pleas are not heard. They end up dead, and then many years later, it turns out that they have been right. So if, let's say, a robust and proper and strong response to the murder of Litvinenko or Politkovskaya happened in 2006, maybe Nemtsov would have been alive now. And that's my major message. As and the sanctions, I agree with Vladimir, is at the moment targeted personal sanctions against assets held in the West is the best way of handling this, but there are problems. We spent a day yesterday talking to various players in this sanctions business in the Congress and in the State Department. It's not easy. For example, it's clear to everybody who would look into the Litvinenko case that the Russian atomic industry provided the murder weapon, and it was not stolen. It was transferred to the FSB for the purpose of murdering a person in the center of London using radioactive weapon. But try to put, let's say, people like Mr. Kiriyenko, who heads the, Sergei Kiriyenko, who heads the Russian nuclear agency on the sanctions list. It's practically impossible. So I would argue specifically for for lowering the threshold and easing the legal and technical hurdles into putting people on sanctions lists to the same level as being used for, let's say, sanctioning people involved in terrorism.
Marina, let me just ask you two last questions before turning to the audience. In retrospect, what is it you think it was that your husband did or said that got particular attention from the Kremlin? Is there one thing that you think really got them upset? Of course, in no way in asking this question am I justifying their reaction, but I'm curious, did you look back and say that maybe was really what kind of pissed them off, to put it rather crudely?
When Sasha did his first public speech in 1998, it was a press conference in Moscow. It was absolutely first time when an officer of security service went to TV and openly talked about corruption, about crime and FSB. It was the first time when he tried to prevent these security office people will take over Russia. But nobody could believe him. Everybody decided it's just a nonsense. When he was arrested and spent months in prison, and when I said he just realized he would be not able to protect safe to us, to me and to our son, we escaped. But after that, he became more critical. He started to write a book, Blowing Up Russia, when he tried to show all evidence who might kill all these people in Moscow in 1999. Mm-hmm. Then he wrote a lot of articles about Chechnya and connection with all terrorists in Chechnya to security service in Russia. When he tried to analyze all these hostages in Nordost, again, it was some sign of security office be involved. Of course, we can talk about this way, why he might be killed. But Sasha did also very important job. He started to cooperate with security service to work against organized crime. And he tried again to show this organized crime not only dangerous to Europe, because we're talking about Europe, but it was a very strong link between organized crime and Russian government. It was a serious. In a moment when he was ready to go to give his statement to Spain. It was November 2006. And how we know he was deadly poisoned in November 1. And this was maybe this. And Sasha already tried to say, now after Soviet Union collapsed, we don't have no ideology of communism party more. But country can't live without ideology. And he said, after these people took over Russia, is the only one ideology of money. If you cross a way, you can earn this money, you will be killed. I mean, Sasha's investigation of this corruption might be a reason he was killed.
Let me ask you one last question, and perhaps Vladimir's terrific and supportive wife is the only one in this room who could relate to this, but what kind of reaction did you get from the British public, from people in the UK to what you were going through? How would you describe the beyond the government, the broader reaction among British society?
It's extraordinary. When Sasha asked me, Marina, you have to talk to people. I mean, when I was asked first time to give interview, I couldn't believe anybody will be interested of us. But it was extraordinary how people were just happy to talk to me. I mean, not only journalists and just the people from public. And it was extraordinary support every time. I never ever had a bad reaction. Why I might do this all these 10 years. If I do understand, it's just, of course it's my personal case. It was my husband who I loved was killed. And I promised my son we will find who killed him. But when it became public interest, I realized it's not just my case. People need to know the truth about this. Until now, on the street of London, people might approach me in a very, very gentle way and to say, we are very proud of you. We are very happy what you're doing. Keep strong. It's unbelievable. I don't think I'm recognizable, even it was a lot of coverage in the newspaper. But I can't believe how people follow this story. In the public, I can't say more how it was a very, very strong support.
Great, thank you. All right, let me open it up for questions. We'll start here with Ilya. I think microphones are coming around, so.
Ilya Zaslavsky, I firstly want to say that it's such a great job that you persisted, Marina, and overcame so many difficulties. So my first question is, the Brits did something. They published this report, but I remember very well that really the case was fizzled out for many years. It probably took Ukraine for Home Office in UK to actually reopen the case, as far as I understood. But still, even after this report, there are no sanctions against Rosatom. There are just very superficial, one could say there is only superficial reaction. So do you think that creates a sort of a sense of impunity for Putin and his colleagues? Because we know it's not just the cases of Boris Nemtsov, Litvinenko, but we know there are convincing reports that first Putin tried it on some of his gangsters in St. Petersburg, Roman Tsepov, who was allegedly killed by polonium in 2004. Then we have many other cases, Perepelichny, and so forth. We can go on and on. So they have shown that they can kill people around the world with all sorts of means. So my question is, do you think there is, because of superficial sanctions, there is a sense of impunity for these people?
First of all, this case, of course, has a very strong background, particularly when Ukraine happened. But it's not only. It's never been stopped. First of all, I say it started after 5 years of Sasha's death. And secondly, it's never been put on the table. Not. It had some difficult story, and I don't like to spend time to explain because we will waste all of this time. But what we have 21st of January of this year, it's not so long time ago. And British never been very fast to react. Is this all in a legal position, I believe. And everything what I received from Theresa May, because I had a personal meeting, I have a letter, they promised to keep reaction in a legal way. And they tried to make this very proper. We will see how it would be. And I'm maybe more optimistic, and after these 10 years, I'm happy to wait. I can wait. I'm trained. And I believe is a moment after what happened in Ukraine, now in Syria, Russia has not so much credibility than it was before. And it would be maybe action much faster. But maybe Alex Goldfarb might add in this situation.
I'm a little bit more aggressive vis-à-vis the British government. The reason that they had this inquiry, it's not because the government decided to do it because of Ukraine. It's because Marina won a court case compelling the British government to hold this inquiry. And in effect, they resisted it all the way for reasons which they themselves said, for reasons, as they said, national security and foreign policy. It's not, diplomats and politicians, they don't like to act under pressure of court decisions. So they are less than we would like to have seen helpful. Because again, I'm old enough to remember Soviet times where dissidents who were released from the Soviet Union or their families were given much support, primarily public support by the leaders of the Western world. I remember Bukovsky seeing Margaret Thatcher and Sharansky seeing President Reagan and that sort of thing. Here we have the government who had their citizen killed in the center of a capital with a radioactive weapon. And we have actually very lukewarm reaction by the government. We're here on our own. The British Embassy is not helping us to arrange meetings, let's say, in the administration. We're doing it courtesy of Free Russia Foundation. In the old days, the British Embassy would be all over the place helping Marina, seeing the president, for example, and so on. So it could have been much better.
Just a couple of words. For me, the epitome of this whole story was this leak in The Guardian just a day before the Owen inquiry report was published. And that was a leak of a Foreign Office memo to David Cameron, which said that whatever the verdict will be, and of course they realized it's not going to be very good, we should not sever relations, we should still be friends, we should still try to maintain business as usual. And for me, that was just the epitome of the whole thing. I mean, if it's not enough when your own citizens gets murdered by a radioactive weapon on the capital street of your own country, then what else does it take? And on a general note, I think it's, for me anyway, it's absolutely certain that had the leaders of Western democracies taken a more principled and firmer stand earlier on with regard to the Putin regime, in the early years of his rule, we would not be seeing the excesses we're seeing now. We would not be seeing the first territorial annexation in Europe since the Second World War. Would not be seeing violations of international borders and wars and conflicts, because it's only natural to expect a regime that tramples on the rights of its own citizens and that violates its own constitution to then begin trampling on the rights of neighboring states and violate international law. Exactly. One directly follows from another. And I think if various Western leaders weren't looking into Putin's eyes so much earlier on, or trying to reset relations with him, and that's a bipartisan comment, I think we'd be in a different place now, but we are where we are.
I took it in that spirit, yes. I'd tell him. And then Marius and Dan. And then over there, we'll get
Thank
to
you. My name is Natalia Boltanskaya. Alex, you talked about support of dissidents. We talked with you about it a lot, and I think you will agree that Soviet authorities were worried about their reputation a lot. Mr. Bukovsky, a couple of years ago, told about that fact that modern Russian authorities don't take care about their reputation. So don't you think that some kind of international support would be much materialistic? without any moral support, something to do to 1, 2, 3.
Before you answer, let me gather a couple here. So Marius, right there, and then Dan.
Marius Laurinavičius, Center for European Policy Analysis here in DC. I'm interested, you just said that you're interested what will be next step of Western authorities, particularly in UK. I'm interested, would it make sense to make a question just in a different way, what will be our next step? Because wouldn't it make sense to establish something or to continue the work of Mr. Litvinenko, in a way just continue investigations he started? I mean, even in the report, there are allegations about the support or some relations, links with the international terrorism. Mr. Litvinenko investigated that. You mentioned international crime. All these things should have been investigated, and some of them already were investigated by Spanish, let's say, prosecutor. But it's not known for international public. Maybe it's the reason why our governments in the West are not taking any action on that. Maybe we should take the initiative into our own hands.
Great. So Alex, why don't you and then Marina?
The comparison with the Soviet leaders and the present leaders of Russia, it is true that the Soviet leaders were more sensitive to the public opinion in the West. Perhaps they were even more insecure than, obviously they were more insecure than the present, but the present leaders have their own vulnerability, and this is, as has been mentioned, their assets and their whole lifestyle, which is anchored to Europe, and that's a very potent leverage on them. So, in a way, they can be likened to, let's say, the sheikhs of the Persian Gulf, who oppress their own people and tramp on every human right, and still are, having their yacht parked in the south of France. So that's essentially the major vulnerability. But the difference is that, of course, there is an ideology. And the ideology in Russia is basically, as I mentioned, anti-Western, and it's a threat. Now, with regard to your question about ongoing investigations, there isn't, you see, as Marina has mentioned, we believe that the most likely reason for murdering Sasha Litvinenko was his participation in the investigation of links between Mr. Putin and his entourage with international organized crime, not terrorism, organized crime, in Spain particularly. This investigation is going on. There is an indictment of Russian mafia figures in Spain, which will lead to the court case, and Putin and his members of his regime are all over this indictment, hundreds of references and evidence. So the issue is not the investigation, all is known. The issue is policy, and to what extent Western policy makers would look into these findings is a policy matter. It's a matter of attitude, I would say.
Yes, I'd just like to add, Sasha's cooperation to investigation case in Spain was completed last summer. Why it was well known? Because we could not use this material in our court because it was in the process. But since last summer, it was a lot of interview of a Spanish prosecutor, and he gave extraordinary evidence of what happened. And it was full Sashan cooperation of this, and I'm very proud he was involved in this case. And by myself, I can't do this because I've never been in a position as Sasha. I supported him when he was an officer as his wife, and I was very proud of him. I could say when somebody tried to describe Sasha like a former KGB spy, is not true. He never worked for KGB, and he never been a spy. And as a small story of what happened with us in Ankara when we were not sure what to do and where to go. And our visit to to American embassy was very unsuccessful. And nobody would take us and to protect us because Sasha was a spy. He did not have any special secrets. And we were left just in Turkey and waiting for a green card. It means Sasha never ever been a spy. He was a good cop, I would say. He was an investigator. And he did his great job when he was in UK. And I'm very proud of him. And I believe everything what he did and what he was not able to complete, we will understand, maybe not now, but in the future.
Just a couple of words, if I may. On Natella's point, they may not care about public opinion or statements or resolutions, but they certainly care about their assets and their visas and their bank accounts. So I think that's where you certainly get their attention if that's what you went after. And Marius, I think, made a very important point. And I think the general point here is that I think the best way for us to honor the memory of our friends who gave their lives to the struggle is to continue their work. There is now, for example, just recently founded the Boris Nemtsov Foundation, which the effort is being led by Boris's daughter, Zhana Nemtsova. She's the president. I have the honor to serve on the board of the foundation. It's just only beginning to operate, but it will continue in all the main areas that were important for Boris, that is public enlightenment and education, investigative reports that he did on corruption like the one we presented in Sochi 2 years ago, also supporting young activists in the Russian opposition and Russian civil society. And I think more broadly, we as his colleagues in the democratic movement have to continue and not give up and carry on, to the best ability that we can, and we're certainly going to do that.
Dan, and then I saw the hand further in back, and then we'll get to you.
I also remember the Soviet times.
Dan Fried from the State Department.
I think now most Democrats and most Republicans, and certainly this administration and the last, understand that there is a relationship between a government's treatment of its own citizens and its behavior abroad. Mm-hmm. Now that sounds like a simple statement, but having lived through the 1970s, when the Ford White House agonized about whether to invite Solzhenitsyn to the White House, I can tell you that this realization, this understanding is not to be taken lightly. It's a big deal. What we do about it in practice is a challenge. We have state interests. We also have interests in human rights and longer-term interests. My government is, as a matter of practice, able to do, let us say, two things at the same time. For example, we're able to cooperate with Russia over Iran and intensify sanctions against Russia in reaction to their aggression against Ukraine. Those are the strongest sanctions that have been imposed by the United States against any country ever in terms of the size of the economy we're sanctioning. So we have to be able to do two things, or even more than two things at the same time, which is easy to say and difficult to do in practice. With respect to the British, I have to say that they have been strong in supporting a coherent, principled Western reaction to Russian aggression against Ukraine, at some cost to themselves. So this is to be applauded. With respect to Ukrainian sanctions, it's public knowledge that some of the Ukrainian sanctions involve actions against some of the so-called cronies and their assets both in Russia and Western Europe. These sanctions are not human rights based. They are based on roughly Ukraine factors. The Magnitsky Act, which has been discussed here, is explicitly is the basis for Russia human rights sanctions. It has two parts, one against those who persecuted Sergei Magnitsky were responsible for his death, and the other part which has to do with those who persecute or commit gross violations of human rights against whistleblowers and human rights activists. On the Magnitsky Act, since it's come up here, I will say that we have in the past and continue to welcome receiving information from NGOs, wherever they are, about possible targets, because the Magnitsky Act is an open-ended process and was designed that way. That's the law. We intend to carry it out. So I will repeat publicly what I've said to some of you privately. We welcome that information. We will go through it. I am not sure I agree that the Magnitsky Act standards should be lowered. It is difficult and time-consuming to make a actionable sanctions finding, but it is worth it because if we are sued, we will win. And it is important that we are not, that our Magnitsky list is not legally vulnerable. But I repeat, we welcome such information. And finally, it is good to see you all here and active. Your message is important, and despite the drama of our current political season in the United States, there is much bipartisan support for what you're doing and what you stand for.
Thank you. In the back with glasses. Yep.
Thank you. So thank you again for coming to speak with us. I had a question more regarding the future of the Russian opposition, and I hope that topic is open. So my question is, so in 2014, Ukraine stood up to the cronyism and the corruption that was rotting their government from within, but the subsequent results have been mixed at best. What lessons for the Russian opposition do you draw from the results of the Maidan?
Why don't there was another question, I think 2 rows in front there. So before you answer that, Vladimir, right there. Yep.
My name is Yuri Terehov. I am the editor of Rufabala.com. My question will be follows. How can you evaluate the necessity of consolidation of the Russian political immigration, namely considering the recent Forum of Free Russia in Vilnius? Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to start, Vladimir?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for it's a very important question about the relations between the Maidan and the Russian opposition. And first of all, I just want to mention that in my view, and I know in the view of many of my colleagues in the opposition, the main motivation for Putin's aggression against Ukraine was actually domestic. It wasn't, geopolitical or spheres of influence and what. I mean, it's an added bonus from their point of view. But the main reason was that he really didn't enjoy those pictures of Mr. Yanukovych boarding his helicopter in Medjugorje and fleeing in haste, as tens of thousands of people were demonstrating against the corruption and the authoritarianism on the streets of Kiev. He really didn't like the analogy and the precedent, because a democratic and successful Ukraine would be a very potent example for Russian society in a way, for instance, that a democratic Lithuania or Estonia isn't, because of the closeness of the common heritage, common history, very close language, religion, and so forth between Russia and Ukraine. So he really was terrified that a success of this experiment in Ukraine would be a contagious example for Russian society. And this is why he set out to do everything he could to crush it and to make sure it was not successful, hence the annexation, hence the aggression, the support for his military proxies in the Donbas region and so forth. So I think a great deal of the problems that now exist in the Ukraine have been caused by Mr. Putin. That is not to say that they haven't got any faults of their own. They certainly have. I don't think it's my place to meddle in their internal affairs, as Mr. Lavrov would like to say. But I would say that I think the most important thing in this regard is to practice what you preach. And if you stand for democracy and for fighting against corruption, it's important to be democratic and behave in this way, and to not engage in corruption yourself. And for this, for instance, I will have always an example of my friend Boris Nemtsov, who always practiced what he preached and who was what he was about. And I think, I know there are very few people like that, admittedly, in world politics, not just in Russian. But I think that's frankly what I have to aspire to. So if you say something, do that. And I just want to quickly thank Ambassador Fried for his comments. It's great to see you as well. And also, just as I mentioned, you said that there's this obvious link between domestic behavior and foreign behavior. But I would also add that it's important to remember, again, what the current Russian Foreign Ministry likes to conveniently forget that domestic behavior and human rights are also not an internal affair of a country. We are both, Russia and the US are both full members of the OSCE, and the document adopted of all places in Moscow in 1991, the OSCE Moscow document, explicitly states that human rights, and as it calls matters of the human dimension, are subject to legitimate international concern and cannot be described as internal affairs of any states. I think that's a principle that it would be useful for you to remind your counterparts on the other line when they try to tell you otherwise.
Alex, you want to jump in?
Yes. I have a comment on with regard to Maidan. Maidan had two components: the revolt against corruption, and basically corruption. And secondly, it was a national liberation movement, a movement of a nation away from being a dominion of an empire into free Europe. So you cannot automatically transfer this to the Russian situation, because in Russia nationalism is not a progressive force. In Ukraine it is, because it's a national liberation. In Russia, nationalists are probably the most stronger supporters of authoritarian imperialist regime. So if Maidan is ever possible in Russia, it will be solely on the economic and anti-corruption basis, as opposed. So it's more complex. Now, with regard to the Russian opposition, again, if I may, I will recall the Soviet times. The Russian opposition and immigration, diaspora abroad desperately needs help. In the Cold War times, there was an industry here supporting Russian opposition movements, primarily, not only, but primarily in the information base, because without Radio Liberty in those days, Radio Free Europe, and Voice of America, and the Russian service of BBC, people fighting the Soviet regime in Russia would feel very bad. Today, there is no such concerted support from Western democracies, not only in the public arena, but in the information, the counter-propaganda field. So it would be very important that again, policymakers here would recognize the political importance in their relations with Russia of supporting democratic movement, particularly immigration, and of beefing out their broadcasting, if you wish, operation.
In seeing if there are any last questions before we wrap up, I too want to pay tribute to Dan Fried for the great work he's doing. It's not enough, Dan, but exactly. But as a friend and my former boss, I do want to pay tribute. Where we are would not have happened without your efforts. So many thanks for that.
You're here.
So, yes. And we'll take one more if there is. Otherwise, we'll wrap up.
Sorry. Hi, Stephanie Rowland
Yes.
from IRI. I just had a question about the future of the Russian opposition in the upcoming Duma elections. If you could speak about the pressures that you're facing and what the strategy for the opposition is.
And I'll add to that, Vladimir, when you answer, there are some who say participating in the Duma elections is playing into the Kremlin's hands. How do you respond to that criticism?
Right, thanks a lot, and thanks. This is a really important question. And of course, we have an election, approaching this year on September the 18th. First of all, we haven't had a real free and fair election in Russia in 16 years. If we're judged by the OSCE and Council of Europe monitoring reports, the last free and fair election we had was in December 1999, which was the last parliamentary election under Boris Yeltsin. Every vote held since then was increasingly flawed, one after another. So what we have today is a complete mockery of electoral processes. We have the opposition simply disqualified from the ballot in most cases. For instance, the party wherein the deputy leader, the People's Freedom Party, Parnas, was disqualified in most jurisdictions where we tried to participate in last year's regional elections. The voting process itself is marred by administrative intimidation, by pervasive media bias, by overwhelming fraud. Up to 14 million votes were stolen, for instance, in the 2011 parliamentary election, according to estimates by independent monitors. And that was, of course, the big reason for the mass protests we had on the streets of Moscow that winter. However, history tells us, I think, that boycotts generally don't work. And you cannot distinguish between, a conscientious boycott and just people being lazy. And I always remember this. I have this vivid image of I once went to Cologne in Germany, and there's a Gestapo museum. And one of the exhibits in that museum is a ballot paper from a one-party fake election that they had in 1936 or 37 under Hitler. And it was, do you support the National Socialist list headed by our Führer Adolf Hitler, yes or no? And somebody put a no. And they obviously kept that ballot paper because I guess they took it to the Gestapo to try to see who it was. And now it made its way into the museum. But for me, that was a really telling experience, And I looked at this no, this cross on the pencil, and I thought that, this person who put this no, the concentration camps weren't on his conscience. The killings of millions of people were not on his or her conscience. All the crimes of the Nazi regime, because he had the courage to go out and to put the no, even though he knew it was, pointless in a general sense, because of course he knew that the yes would win, just as we know what will happen in our so-called elections. But that's not a reason to give up and stop everything and just take the comfortable position of, I'm not participating because yes, of course it's rigged. But we still have to participate, and we still have to try to reach our message across to as many people as we can. And I travel around Russia a lot. I go to a lot of different regions and cities, and I see every day, not every week, I should say, I meet a lot of people who are against what's happening, who think that this regime is leading us into an abyss, and who want changes. And I think for those people, we have no right just to be passive. We have to do something. And so we're going to use this flawed and sham electoral process to try to get our message across, but also, as importantly, to try to help the young opposition civil society activists to gain some experience by participating in this process, to get some reputation, to gain some name recognition. And in particular, the Open Russia movement, which I represent, we're going to take maybe 15, 20, 25 candidates for the State Duma in single-member constituencies, districts in September. Mostly big cities. I mean, the ones we've chosen so far, it's Moscow, Novosibirsk, St. Petersburg, Chelyabinsk. I think there'll be some others. It'll be a wide geography, but mostly big cities, more than 1 million people, because those, of course, are easier to campaign in. There's more internet access. The logistics are better. And we're going to help those young people to get their political experience, because the day will come. Nothing is forever, and Mr. Putin is no exception. And the day will come when we'll have to fight a real election. But it will be too late to get ready then. We have to get ready now. So that's what we'll do this year.
Well, in closing, let me just come back to the title of today's meeting, Silencing Voices of Russian Opposition. And for those in Russia, even some outside of Russia, the Kremlin resorts to the worst, most thuggish criminal methods to try to do that. But despite all these threats, intimidation, attacks, go out of their way at significant risk to speak out. If we go silent, it's by choice, and that's unconscionable to me. And so we have an obligation to stand with people like the three up here to make sure that their voices are heard loud and clear. So let me thank Damon and Atlantic Council, Natalia, who seems to have disappeared, and Free Russia, Alex, for everything you're doing from London, Vladimir, for being alive.
That's not my.
Well, I'm still going to give you credit for it, but for also being a model of persistence, perseverance, determination to continue to go back, to continue to fight the good fight, and Marina for being the absolute model of grace and dignity after going through what I think none of us could really fathom and understand. Really want to pay tribute to you, a warm welcome to you here in Washington, and thanks to all of you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.